Harlow Quadra was an up-and-coming star in the world of gay pornography.
He was one of the fellows that was really desired.
His rise to fame was engineered by his business partner and boyfriend, Joe Caracas.
Harlow was the one that was being showcased, and Joe was the one that was setting up opportunities for him.
Their partnership was both steamy and lucrative.
They bought this $500,000 home, and all of a sudden they're driving these really expensive cars. They're both wearing huge diamonds.
But their romance and desire for excess became the focus of a police investigation when a rival porn producer fell victim to a horrific crime.
Whoever killed him had a real personal hatred for him that just went very, very deep.
Now get the inside story of this sordid web of manipulation and betrayal. Witness how greed and jealousy sent their love affair spiraling out of control. And learn how it soon became clear that behind the scenes of Harlow and Joe's porn empire, there was something far more sinister going on.
This case had everything. There was sex, deception, murder, arson, a whodunit.
It was something that kind of shook the industry.
It was shocking to everyone involved.
January 24th, 2007. It was just before 8 p.m. in the small town of Dallas Township, Pennsylvania, when local 911 received numerous reports of a house fire in progress on Midland Drive. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was completely engulfed in flames, and neighbors believed the resident who lived there might be trapped inside.
The person who called had mentioned that the person who lived there, their car was still in the driveway.
The firefighters immediately began battling the blaze. Once the flames had been extinguished, a rescue team was sent in to search the home's charred remains. And through the smoke and ash, they soon made a gruesome discovery. On what had been the living room sofa, they found the badly burned body of a man.
The male body at the time was severely burned, third-degree burns, pretty much the entire front of his body.
The charred victim matched neighbors' description of the owner of the house. But the body's condition meant it would be up to the medical examiner to confirm the identity, establish the precise time of death, and determine the exact cause. But what authorities didn't then know was a closer examination would soon reveal this house fire was no accident, but a sinister attempt to cover up a cold-blooded murder.
It was a very shocking thing that someone would go at lengths to do just to get someone on their side.
Miami, Florida is known for its exciting nightlife and popular beach resorts. But for young Harlow Quadra, growing up in South Florida was anything but a vacation. Born in 1981, Harlow's home life was unstable from the start. His father left when he was still a baby, and his mother struggled to provide for him and his two brothers on her own.
Harlow Quadra came from a poor Hispanic family that was of no means. He had a struggle in life.
When Harlow was still young, his mother remarried, and his new stepfather provided much-needed financial stability to the family. But it reportedly came at a terrible price. Whenever his mother left, Harlow was allegedly subjected to sexual abuse. The traumatized boy was too afraid to tell anyone what was going on at the time.
He was allegedly sexually abused repeatedly as a child, particularly in his adolescent and teen years.
According to reports, the abuse continued for 10 years before Harlow's mother finally learned what was happening and left with the children. But the emotional damage had already been done. As a teenager, Harlow had trouble relating to his classmates and grew up feeling lonely and depressed. But his emotional problems didn't just stem from his stepfather's alleged abuse. He was also harboring a secret he was ashamed to admit. He was gay.
He's from a Latino family, so there's a lot of issues around machismo, around the idea of what a man is that conflicted or collided with his growing realization of his sexuality. And so as a result, as soon as he was able, he fled the nest
Harlow enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 2000 when he was 18. He was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, where he trained to become a nurse.
Harlow was coming to terms with his sexuality and decided to join the Navy as a means of getting out of this chaos and creating a life for himself.
Harlow liked the structure and discipline the military provided, but it still wasn't easy. The Navy's policy of don't ask, don't tell meant Harlow had to keep his sexuality a secret. Combined with the shame he felt about his stepfather's sexual abuse, Harlow wasn't fully able to express himself. But all that would change in the spring of 2000 when he met a handsome older man in an online chat room that would affect Harlow's life in ways he never imagined. 26-year-old Joe Caracas. Joe Caracas grew up near Norfolk in Virginia Beach. Compared to Harlow's childhood, Joe had lived a charmed life. He graduated at the top of his high school class and went on to serve as youth minister in his family's church. But just like Harlow, Joe was keeping his sexuality a secret. And the pressure of keeping it bottled up led to problems controlling his temper.
He seems to be an impulse-driven person throughout his life. You see instances where he acts out of his anger.
Joe's anger led to fights with his classmates, as well as heated arguments with the church elders. Eventually, he was asked to leave the ministry. Hoping to find new direction in his life, Joe enlisted in the Marine Corps. Barracks life and the rigors of basic training seemed like an ideal way for Joe to put the past behind him. But right off the bat, Joe chafed at the Marines' strict routine and rigid chain of command.
He didn't want to do things that he was told to do. He basically, butted heads with his superiors, and that's just obviously not something that you do when you're in boot camp.
Thanks to his combative attitude, Joe quit his military career just 2 weeks into his enlistment. Even though Joe wasn't cut out for life in the Marines, he soon discovered that his muscular build and masculine good looks made him a hotly sought-after commodity within the Virginia Beach meat market, catering to a specific clientele.
Joe began working as a male escort. He was very good looking and he was fit, and there were men who wanted to spend time with him.
Within a short amount of time, Joe had become one of Virginia Beach's top-paid and most in-demand escorts, with a long list of regulars and loyal clients. Business was so good, he was soon able to start his own escort business and hired several other male escorts to work for him.
You see him breaking into his own and trying to develop his own service for male escorts in Virginia.
But while Joe's sex work was certainly profitable, it lacked the passion and intimacy of a real relationship. He craved a connection with someone that went beyond clients and casual hookups. He wanted a meaningful relationship. And when he met Harlow Quadra on a dating website for local gay men, he was immediately taken. Barely 18, Harlow appeared even younger, and Joe found his boyish good looks almost too good to be true.
Well, they had a first date and walked around and spent several hours talking to each other.
Harlow was just as impressed by Joe. He was everything Harlow was looking for in a man: older, confident, and successful. As for Joe's unorthodox career, Harlow didn't mind. In fact, the money Joe brought in as a high-class escort was a huge turn-on.
Harlow wanted somebody to take care of him, and here's a guy with the means to do that. The prospect of this was very attractive to him.
The couple's sexual attraction was impossible to deny, and their relationship quickly became physical.
Harlow fulfilled needs for Joe in terms of affection and attention, and I think for Harlow, Joe fulfilled needs of dominance and direction.
It wasn't long before Harlow found himself falling in love with Joe. But Harlow also knew that having an openly gay relationship would end his Navy career. So Joe suggested that Harlow quit the service to live with him. Harlow happily agreed. With Joe, he finally felt loved and accepted for the first time in his life.
Harlow was looking for a family of his own in some way. He must have been incredibly lonely, not just in the military, but in life.
Almost 3 years after joining the Navy, Harlow received an honorable discharge. At first, Harlow didn't worry about finding work and was content to let Joe pay for everything. But he soon grew bored. That's when Joe suggested he start a new career as one of his escorts.
Joe thought Harlow would do well as a gay male escort. There was a market for his look. He was young looking and he was fit. Joe saw an opportunity to make money with Harlow. He didn't even care that he was sleeping with other men, as long as it was making him money.
Harlow was apprehensive about the idea at first, but Joe talked him into trying it for just one date.
It took some grooming on the part of Joe to get Harlow comfortable with the idea of going out to a client's home. But I think the money and Joe's influence over time wore down those feelings of any concern and guilt.
Just as Joe predicted, Harlow soon became his most successful escort. But as well as they were doing, Joe knew the real money was in the gay porn industry. And Harlow had the youthful looks to make him a star.
He was a very popular escort, and he could have been very popular in the porn industry.
Harlow was already no stranger to sex for money, and doing it on camera wasn't much of a stretch. In 2002, he and Joe started their own film company and website, with Joe acting as director and Harlow as the company's star.
Joe and Harlow decided to branch out into the world of gay porn movies. And these weren't just any movies, these were classified as barely legal and bareback, men having sex without condoms on.
Harlow and Joe's movies were a huge hit, and their website quadrupled its traffic in a short amount of time. Harlow had become an overnight star, and between their films and their booming escort business, the money was rolling in. For Harlow, who'd grown up with nothing, it was almost too good to be believed. Nothing was out of reach anymore, and he and Joe reveled in their flashy and upscale lifestyle.
They bought this $500,000 home, and all of a sudden they're driving these really expensive cars. They're both wearing huge diamonds in their ears.
For the next few years, Harlow and Joe enjoyed a life of luxury. But it soon became clear that they were going to have to start planning for the future. By 2007, Harlow was 26, and his boy toy days were almost over.
Harlow was young, and he had the look, and there's an expiration date on that.
Both Joe and Harlow knew that in order to revenue up, their production company needed some fresh blood, a new male star to revitalize sales. Luckily, Joe already had his eye on the perfect young man for the job, and he was determined to see his vision become a reality, no matter what the cost. Coming up, police take a closer look into the fatal house fire on Midland Drive, and the investigation unveils a shocking discovery.
The gentleman was basically decapitated.
And the grim evidence ties back to a brutally intimate motive.
Whoever killed him had a real personal hatred for him that just went very, very deep.
When closeted Navy nurse Harlow Quadra met gay male escort Joe Caracas, he not only met someone who encouraged him to embrace his own sexuality, but a partner with a perfect combination of passion, lust, and never-ending excitement. Harlow eventually went into the escort business with Joe, and in 2002, the couple decided to branch out, making porn films with the youthful Harlow as the star. By 2007, business was booming, and Harlow and Joe were living a life of luxury.
High-end cars, nice house, expensive watches, ate out every night, so they were living very high.
But the couple's next project would take things in a more dangerous direction. While Harlow and Joe were scripting their next porn shoot at their home in Virginia Beach, firefighters 400 miles north in Dallas Township, Pennsylvania, were responding to a house fire on a quiet suburban street.
We had a very heavy fire coming out of the front porch.
Neighbors feared the owner, 44-year-old Brian Coaches, was still trapped inside. Fire crews battled the blaze, and once flames had been mostly extinguished, a search and rescue team entered the smoking residence. In the living room, they found the badly burned body of an adult male.
We didn't know who it was at the time because the body was burned to the point where it was unidentifiable.
The body was removed and transferred to the coroner's office for identification. Meanwhile, fire investigators worked to determine the cause of the blaze. From the heavy charring in the living room, it appeared the fire had started there and had grown quickly. A detail that stood out to investigators, since house fires usually take hours to build into an inferno. But this one had taken minutes. And that wasn't the only troubling thing investigators discovered.
I started downstairs just looking around to see what could be the possible cause of this fire. And in the dining room, I found a smoke detector laying on a table.
It looked like someone had removed the smoke detector before the fire started, which suggested this wasn't an accident, but an act of arson.
I had a real bad gut feeling that there was something wrong with this fire.
And any doubt as to whether foul play was involved vanished as soon as the coroner took a look at the victim's charred remains.
The gentleman was basically decapitated. He had 28 stab wounds, including one at the groin area.
This was something that was planned. This was more of a targeted murder.
But who was the victim? Dental records soon confirmed what everyone had assumed.
A forensic dentist made an immediate identification that this was Brian Kocius.
With Brian positively identified, the next order of business was to determine who killed him and why. To detectives, the nature of Brian's wounds indicated a very personal motive.
Whoever killed Brian had a real personal hatred for him that just went very, very deep.
But who hated Brian Kocius enough to kill him in such a violent and horrific way? When questioned, Brian's neighbors told investigators that Brian was a recluse who rarely left his house. He did throw occasional parties, however, with lots of attractive young men. But as police dug deeper in Brian Kocius' background, they were surprised to discover he wasn't just a reclusive man living and partying in the suburbs.
Brian was involved in the production of gay pornographic films. He owned his own company, Cobra Video, and he was using these young men in his videos.
He was so involved in the gay pornography industry and actually was filming some of the scenes in his home.
Brian's secret life as a porn producer was a surprise to detectives. But what stood out most to police was that in 2001, shortly after founding his video company, Brian had been arrested for videotaping himself having sex with a 15-year-old boy. The felony charges had been dropped when Brian pled guilty to the lesser charge of corruption of a minor. But to detectives, the allegation seemed serious enough to drive any parent to take matters into their own hands.
You have to think of parents of a young adult who this 40-something-year-old man had had sex with. Yeah, they definitely could have committed this murder.
When police floated their theory by Brian's best friend, Robert Wagner, he didn't think so. He claimed Brian hadn't known the boy was underage at the time and was now careful to use legal forms known as 2257s to document that all of his porn actors were consenting adults.
2257s. That's the legal document that you sign stating that you're over the age of 18.
But when detectives reviewed the materials collected from Brian's house, they noticed there were several items from his production company missing, including several computers, and all of the 2257 forms from the actors that worked on Brian's films.
Those are very valuable because if the FBI ever comes knocking and wants to see them, you have to be able to produce those, or else you could go to jail for potentially producing child pornography.
Detectives couldn't help but wonder, was Brian's killer not only trying to get rid of him, but his company as well? Investigators dug deeper into Brian's business, looking for potential enemies. They didn't have to go very far. Cobra Video's star performer was the biggest name in gay porn, a 20-year-old named Sean Lockhart, who was more famous for his screen name, Brent Corrigan.
Sean Lockhart was considered at the time one of the premier porn actors.
I heard him described as the Tom Cruise of gay porn.
It seemed Brian caught Sean's manager, Grant Roy, trying to create a separate production company for Sean to begin a solo career. Problem was, Sean was still under contract with Cobra Video.
It became open warfare between Brian Coaches and Sean Lockhart.
The ensuing legal battle had cost Brian a considerable amount of money, and police learned that Sean had even threatened to destroy Brian by telling the media he was underage when he started performing for Cobra Video.
That really scared Brian because he'd already had this run-in with a 15-year-old and it already had hurt him badly.
When detectives tracked down Sean in San Diego, California, he told them that he and Grant had already worked out their differences with Brian. They'd settled out of court earlier in the year.
We established that Mr. Lockhart and Roy were nowhere near Pennsylvania at the time of the murders. They had rock-solid alibis.
But Sean told detectives that he did know someone else who wanted Brian out of the picture. At the Adult Video News Awards in January, he and Grant had been approached by another young performer and his manager about the possibility of going into business together.
The AVN Awards would be equivalent to the Oscars. Not only porn stars, but directors, pretty much anybody that's in the porn industry.
Sean told police that he explained his situation with Cobra Video, but the two men assured Sean that they had a surefire way of getting him out of his contract with Brian Coaches permanently. Coming up, Joe and Harlow write new rules in the conquest of the adult video world.
They said, what if he was gone, hinting that let's kill him so we could make these movies together.
And new evidence unveils the name of an unexpected and mysterious suspect in the Brian Coaches murder.
We found out that a man named Danny Moylan was supposed to meet Mr. Coaches at the precise time of the murder.
Professional male escorts Harlow Quadra and Joe Caracas were more than just lovers. They were partners in every sense of the word. Not only were they running a successful male escort service, they also founded a porn video company with Harlow as its star.
Harlow was one of their big guys in the stable. He was one of the fellows that was really desired.
For a few years, the couple enjoyed the fruits of their success, living in an expensive Virginia Beach home, driving luxury cars, and sporting excessive amounts of bling.
Harlow Quadra pulled in a lot of money through the escort business. They had their websites. They were spending lavishly.
But an investigation into the brutal murder of rival porn producer Brian Coaches would shine an unwelcome spotlight on the lavish wealth they'd acquired in the video skin trade. When detectives first learned that their victim was a porn producer, the list of potential killers seemed endless. But one name immediately stuck out to them: Brian Coaches' star performer, Sean Lockhart.
Sean Lockhart was a very coveted porn performer, and so there was a lot of competition to have him film with certain studios.
In 2005, Sean's manager, Grant Roy, had tried to get him out of his contract with Brian to start a solo career. The dispute had turned ugly, and Sean threatened to destroy Brian's company, Cobra Video, by telling the press he was underage when he started performing. To investigators, it seemed like a perfect motive for murder. But when they tracked down Sean in San Diego, he told them it was all water under the bridge. They'd settled the contract dispute, and Sean's alibi proved to be rock solid.
They were in California at the time that this murder was occurring, and it wasn't possible that they were involved.
But Sean told investigators he did know two other people who stood to profit from Brian being out of the picture. Another young porn star and his manager who'd approached Sean and his manager Grant Roy at a porn industry award show a few months earlier. Their names, Harlow Quadra and Joe Caracas.
There was a stunning meeting between Harlow Quadra, Joseph Caracas, at the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas during the AVN Awards, Adult Video News Awards.
Sean told police that Harlow and Joe pitched them the idea of going into business together. They felt that by combining Sean's star power with Harlow's rising popularity, they stood to make a fortune.
The vision of Sean Lockhart coming to work for Harlow Quadra and Joe Koreckis was that their porn business would take that next step up.
Sean and Grant were impressed with Harlow, but said they'd have to wait until Sean's contract with Brian Coaches and Cobra Video was over. It was clear that it was news Joe and Harlow didn't want to hear. And Joe seemed particularly desperate to help figure out a way to remove Brian from the picture. In fact, Sean remembered Joe asking, what if Brian was gone?
Sean Lockhart says that initially went over his head, like, what do you mean gone? Like, he's going away on vacation or something. And they said, no, like, what if he was gone? So hinting that, let's kill him so we could make these movies together.
It was a stunning revelation and led detectives to immediately reach out to Joe and Harlow. But they declined to speak with investigators. With Joe and Harlow stonewalling police, law enforcement decided to take a closer look at their companies, Norfolk Male Escorts and BoyBatter.com. Savvy business instincts and an innate understanding of what their audience craved seemed to have made both Joe and Harlow wealthy men. Nothing seemed out of reach, and they spent lavishly on themselves and each other.
They lived a lavish lifestyle.
But a closer look at the balance sheet revealed a surprising truth. Joe and Harlow's extravagant lifestyle was costing them more than they were making.
Yes, they had a beautiful home, but it was mortgaged to the hilt. They were spending money on cars, on expensive men's watches, so it was going out faster than it was coming in.
They generally had to make around $3,700 a day to basically break even.
In fact, investigators learned that the couple was heavily in debt. To detectives, it seemed plausible that Joe and Harlow would do just about anything to dig themselves out of that hole.
The level of debt that existed there created pressure and motivation to act in a desperate way. Harlow can't be a prostitute or a porn actor forever, and so there's going to have to be some longer-term plan to keep the money coming in.
Thanks to Sean Lockhart, detectives now knew that the plan was for Joe and Harlow to go into business with the porn superstar. The only obstacle would have been rival porn producer Brian Coaches. But were they willing to kill Brian to see their plan become a reality? It was a plausible theory, but so far detectives didn't have any proof. Eager to find some evidence that tied Joe or Harlow back to the crime, investigators decided to take a closer look at Brian's business affairs. Since Brian ran his business out of his home, they were specifically looking to see if Joe, Harlow, or anyone else had visited him there in the last few days before he was murdered. Detectives obtained warrants for Brian's phone and email records to see if he'd made plans with anyone. Sure enough, they found several emails from a young man that caught their interest.
We immediately found out that a man named Danny Moylan was supposed to meet Mr. Kosas at the precise time of the murder.
In his emails, Danny described himself as a barely legal twink who was interested in working for Cobra Video. And despite Brian's previous legal problems, the temptation to hook up with a new performer seemed too much to resist.
I think when Brian gets these emails, he's probably very excited at the idea of this young fellow that wants to learn about the porno industry.
From their correspondence, Danny seemed to take some convincing, but eventually agreed to a screen test with Brian at his home on January 24th. Phone records indicated Brian had been on the phone with his attorney at the time Danny was scheduled to arrive. Brian's lawyer was able to confirm the young man had indeed shown up.
He overheard his client welcome Danny Moylan at the door.
Based on the time of his visit, detectives were beginning to wonder if Danny Moylan could have been Brian Coach's killer. But a search revealed that no such person existed. Detectives were confused until a search of files recovered from Brian's house revealed something very interesting.
When we secured the backup records to Mr. Kosas's computers, there was a photograph of Danny Moylan.
And although the name on the photograph was different, detectives knew it was a picture of a young actor they were already very familiar with. Coming up, the revelation of Danny Moylan's true identity blows the case wide open.
This was not Danny Moylan. This was Harlow Quadra out of Virginia Beach.
And to bring a killer to justice, police must ask another porn star to give the performance of his life.
Mr. Quadra said, seeing that go down, it's sick, but it made me feel better inside.
Over the course of their passionate 6-year partnership, 25-year-old Harlow Quadra and 33-year-old Joe Caracas had risen from a pair of small-time escorts to become major players in the gay porn industry.
They bought this $500,000 home. They're driving these really expensive cars. They're both wearing huge diamonds.
Harlow was one of the hottest up-and-coming performers. Joe was his manager. Together, they seemed unstoppable. And in 2007, they were planning their next big move, one that would have them partnering with porn icon Sean Lockhart.
They really believed that bringing Sean Lockhart in was worth $1 million.
But the investigation into the gruesome death of rival porn producer Brian Coaches had revealed the couple's success was merely an illusion. And Joe and Harlow now found themselves playing new roles as murder suspects. When police obtained backups of Brian Coach's computer files, they discovered photographs sent by a young man named Danny Moylan, who was scheduled for a casting couch session with Brian on the night of his murder. But when investigators looked at Danny's headshots, they recognized him as an actor they were already familiar with.
This was not Danny Moylan. This was Harlow Quadra out of Virginia Beach.
But why was Harlow posing as Danny Moylan? Police decided to reach out to Harlow again for an interview. Once more, he declined to speak with authorities. But the performer wasn't so shy about talking to the media.
I sent Harlow an email, and to my surprise, he called me and I interviewed him.
Harlow claimed he was being set up by someone using his photos. As a porn actor, his pictures were all over the internet. So anyone could have sent those messages to Brian Coaches.
But he right away denied his involvement.
But what Harlow didn't know was that the state police had a computer crime unit who could trace the emails from Danny Moylan using the computer's IP address, a unique electronic fingerprint.
Who was assigned this IP address on this date and time. They come back to the Stratham Court address in Virginia Beach, which is the home owned by Harlow Quadra and Joseph Caracas.
The IP address it showed, these were generated using a fake identity, Danny Moylan. So now we had a lead on our killer.
To detectives, it appeared that Harlow and Joe had used Brian's weakness for underage boys to lower his guard in order to murder him, and then torched the house to get rid of the evidence.
The whole Danny Moylan ruse was just an attempt by Joe Caracas and Harlow Quadra to get close to Brian Coaches to carry out their plan.
On February 10th, police obtained a search warrant for Harlow and Joe's Virginia Beach home. But when investigators arrived, the couple was nowhere to be found.
When, Harlow and Joe had found out that the police were looking for them, they went down to Florida.
While Harlow and Joe hid out in Florida, investigators back in Virginia found several suspicious items in their house that appeared to link the couple to the crime.
There's some of Brian Coach's property in their home. There was a tape found there that is a master tape belonging to Cobra Video. There's a Rolex watch with the initials BCK, Brian Coach's initials.
Police also found a receipt from a Walmart not far from Brian Coach's house, dated January 23rd, the day before the murder. And according to the receipt, the couple had purchased a strange assortment of items.
The only items they bought that day were condoms, KY jelly, and lighter fluid.
There's no conceivable reason why you'd take lighter fluid other than the fact that you plan to set something on fire.
Canvassing hotels near Brian Coach's home, investigators discovered the couple had checked into the Fox Ridge Motel the night before Brian Coach's was murdered.
State police went there, asked for registration records the day of the murder. And lo and behold, they found a registration record that started out Joe Carrica at 1028 Stratham Court.
All the evidence that we obtained, everything leads up, pointing to Quadra and Caracas.
But police still didn't have a murder weapon or any physical evidence tying the couple to the murder. To make matters more complicated, Harlow and Joe were still on the run. But it appeared that they were still trying to operate their web-based porn business remotely. So investigators decided to try and draw them out by enlisting the aid of one of their fellow porn stars.
Grant Roy and Sean Lockhart wanted to clear their names. However, they also wanted to find out who killed Brian Koshis and bring those people to justice.
With Grant and Sean on board, police asked them to reach out to Harlow and Joe to rekindle their discussion about a partnership now that Brian Koshis was out of the picture. And just as they'd hoped, the lovers took the bait.
Even in the midst of this police investigation that's swirling all around them, they're still trying to get their porno business up and going.
The plan was to outfit Grant with a wireless recording device so they could record Harlow and Joe confessing to the murder. But before the meeting could take place, Harlow and Joe got cold feet. They told Grant the police investigation had made them paranoid, and they were suspicious that Sean and Grant might be cooperating with the police. But instead of calling off the meeting, Joe suggested they all meet at a local nude beach. There, they could be sure they weren't being recorded. But that presented detectives with a particularly difficult problem.
We're wondering, how are we going to do a body wire in a nudist beach? You can't put one in a towel.
It was Grant's idea to place the microphone into a key fob, which in retrospect was actually a very good idea. You really can't wear anything, but keys don't seem out of place.
With the recording device safely hidden, Grant and Sean met with Harlow and Joe at the nude beach the next day. And with police listening in, Grant steered the topic of conversation toward Brian Koshis and his untimely demise.
Grant was asking, did Brian go quick? And that's when Harlow responded, yes, he went quick.
It was quick. You never saw it coming.
You were in there with him for a little while.
Yeah. Actually, seeing that go down actually did sick, but it made me feel better inside. It almost felt like I got revenge.
Upon hearing the confessions, investigators moved in and made their arrests. Harlow Quadra and Joe Caracas were both charged with first-degree murder. At the time, prosecutors felt they had more than enough evidence to convict the lovers. But what they weren't then taking into account was both Harlow and Joe's talent as performers and their abilities to seduce a jury.
He was an actor, so it doesn't surprise me one little bit.
He was putting on a show and he thought he could snow the jury.
Coming up, prosecutors seek to drive a wedge between the two lovers.
I think that Joe realized that he had to be as truthful as possible.
And while Joe talks to police, Harlow spins his own version of what happened to Brian Koshis. Will a looming murder conviction turn Joe and Harlow against each other?
Is he really capable of something like this?
When Navy seaman Harlow Quadra met ex-Marine Joe Caracas in 2000, he thought he'd found the man of his dreams. Harlow gave up his military career to become Joe's partner, both in life and in their burgeoning porn business. But the investigation into the brutal murder of rival film producer Brian Koshis had revealed that the couple had been up to something far more shocking and sinister than mere pornography.
Quadra and Caracas viewed Mr. Koshis as their arch rival, and he had to be eliminated.
Now Harlow's acting days were over, and he and Joe both faced the death penalty. Following their indictments, Harlow continued to deny any involvement in the murder. But Joe surprised investigators by turning on his lover.
Because of the death penalty was on the table, Joseph Caracas and his lawyers decided it was best for him to plead guilty to second-degree murder.
Joe would serve life in prison instead of rolling the dice with the jury. Once the deal was in place, Joe told authorities just how the dirty deed went down.
Joe dropped Harlow off in the front, drove around to the back where Brian wouldn't be able to see the vehicle. Harlow goes in, murders Brian.
It became clear that it was Harlow that was the actor or the principal, and that Joe would be considered the accomplice.
On February 24th, 2009, the trial of Harlow Quadra began. Prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence, including the items belonging to Brian Coaches that had been found in Harlow and Joe's Virginia Beach home, and the lovers' taped confession.
It was quick. We never saw it coming.
Harlow's defense claimed that the taped conversation on the beach hadn't been a murder confession, but an indication that Harlow had seen Brian killed by Harlow's controlling lover, Joe Caracas.
Joe was the real killer. We had proof that he was able to control Harlow, and we were going to try to convince the jury that Harlow wasn't the guy and it was Joe.
Taking the stand in his own defense, Harlow told the court that from the start of their relationship, Joe controlled his life, convincing him to give up a promising career and effectively turning him into a prostitute.
He came from a poor Hispanic family of no means, and Joe mesmerized him and took him under his wing and literally pimped him out, sold him, beat him up.
Harlow admitted that he'd gone to Brian Coach's house to convince him to let Sean Lockhart out of his contract. But Joe had barged in with a knife and killed Brian in a fit of rage.
Joe comes storming in, punches Brian, they get into a fight.
But would the jury believe his story? On March 16, 2009, they announced they'd reached a verdict. They found Harlow guilty of first-degree murder.
These jury deliberations were very fast. They decided to give him life in prison.
For prosecutors and for the family of Brian Coaches, justice had been served. And with both Harlow and Joe carted off to prison, the case was officially closed. But for those familiar with the story, there was still one troubling question. Why had these two self-obsessed lovers gone to such unimaginable lengths in the pursuit of fame and fortune?
The two that were convicted of committing this crime thought that they were going to be able to get away with it.
On February 14th, 2018, Valentine's Day, students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, were living through what should have been an ordinary school afternoon. It was a day associated with friendship, family, and affection. Inside the school, students were attending classes, teachers were carrying out their usual responsibilities, and the rhythms of an ordinary school day continued. Nothing about the date itself suggested that it would become one of the darkest days in the history of American schools. Yet that afternoon, a former student returned to the campus, entered Building 12, and opened fire. By the time the attack was over, 17 people had been killed and 17 others had been wounded. The dead included 14 students and 3 members of the school staff. The youngest victims were 14 years old. The oldest was 49. The attack would lead to one of the most closely examined criminal investigations in the United States, a capital case that eventually ended with 34 life sentences, and a national examination of warnings that had existed before the shooting. But before the investigations, the hearings, and the arguments over punishment, there was the afternoon itself. At approximately 2:06 p.m., 19-year-old Nicholas Jacob Cruz was picked up by an Uber. Cruz was not a stranger to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. He had once been a student there. His history at the school, however, had ended in 2017 when he was expelled because of disciplinary problems. On February 14th, he was returning not as a student, but as a former student. At approximately 2:19 p.m., the Uber brought Cruz to the school. Roughly 2 minutes later, at around 2:21 p.m., he entered Building 12. Within seconds, the shooting began. The speed of what followed would become one of the defining characteristics of the attack. Cruz moved through the building and fired into classrooms and hallways. Students and staff members who had entered the school expecting an ordinary afternoon were suddenly confronted with an emergency that they could not have anticipated. The building became the center of a rapidly unfolding crisis. The people inside had different lives, different ages, and different responsibilities, but in those minutes they were connected by the same danger. Among the students who died were 14-year-old Alyssa Alhadef, a freshman and soccer player; 14-year-old Martin Duque Anguiano, also a freshman; 17-year-old Nicholas Dworet, a senior and swimmer; 14-year-old Jamie Gutenberg; 15-year-old Luke Hoyer; 14-year-old Cara Loughran; 14-year-old Gina Montalto, a freshman who participated in Winter Guard; 17-year-old Joaquin Oliver; 14-year-old Elena Petty; 14-year-old Alex Schachter; 16-year-old Carmen Skintrup; 15-year-old Peter Wong, a sophomore and JROTC member; 18-year-old Meadow Pollock, and 17-year-old Helena Ramsey. The adults who died were Scott Beigel, 35, a teacher and coach; Aaron Faze, 37, a football coach and member of the school's security staff; and Chris Hickson, 49, the school's athletic director and a member of the security staff. Their names would later become part of the permanent record of the tragedy. But at the moment the shooting began, they were not names in a historical account. They were members of a school community. Some were students beginning their high school years. Some were approaching graduation. The adults had responsibilities that placed them in positions of care and authority. The attack destroyed those ordinary distinctions. According to the supplied investigative timeline, the shooting continued through the building for several minutes. By approximately 2:27 p.m., crews abandoned the gun and backpack and left Building 12. The violence inside the building had ended, but the emergency had not. Around 2:29 p.m., crews blended into the students fleeing the school. That detail became especially important because it meant the person responsible was no longer easily distinguishable from the people trying to escape. Students were running away from the building, and crews was able to move among them. The school was still a scene of mass violence, but the suspect was already outside. The FBI's broader chronology places the beginning of the shooting at approximately 2:30 p.m., while the more detailed timeline records the entry into Building 12 and the first shots around 2:21 p.m. The difference reflects the varying levels of precision used in different official accounts. What is not in dispute is the sequence. Crews arrived at the school, entered Building 12, began shooting, killed 17 people, wounded 17 others, left the building, and escaped into the surrounding area. He was not immediately arrested at the school. Instead, the search continued. Crews walked away from the campus and, according to the supplied timeline, appeared at a Walmart at approximately 2:50 p.m. He later went to a McDonald's at around 3:01 p.m. These movements would become important pieces of the investigation because they helped establish what happened after he left the school. While crews moved through the area, authorities were confronting the aftermath at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. The number of victims was becoming clear. Families would soon begin receiving devastating news. Students and staff had been caught in an event that had transformed their school in minutes. Investigators would later have to reconstruct every stage of the attack and trace Cruz's movements after he left the scene. But at that moment, the immediate task was simpler and more urgent: find the person responsible. Approximately 75 minutes after the shooting began, that search ended. At around 3:41 p.m., Cruz was discovered by a police officer in Coral Springs. He was arrested without a gunfight at the time of his capture. The arrest marked the end of the immediate search, but it marked only the beginning of the larger investigation. Cruz was now in custody. The school remained the scene of a mass killing. 17 people were dead, and 17 had survived being shot. Investigators now had to determine not only what Cruz had done, but how the attack had happened and what had preceded it. That backward-looking investigation would reveal that Cruz had not been completely unknown to institutions around him before February 14th. His childhood had included documented behavioral and social adjustment problems. He had received mental health support beginning at approximately 11 years old and continuing until 18. He had experienced disciplinary difficulties at school and had ultimately been expelled from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in 2017. Months before the shooting, the FBI had also received information concerning a threatening YouTube comment about becoming a school shooter. Investigators could not identify the person behind the comment, and that investigation was closed in October 2017. Then, on January 5, 2018, a person acquainted with Cruz contacted the FBI and raised concerns specifically about him. The caller reported concerns about Cruz possessing guns, speaking about wanting to kill people, behaving erratically, and displaying troubling material on social media. The caller also expressed concern that Cruz could carry out a school shooting. After the massacre, the FBI acknowledged that the information should have been treated as a potential threat to life and forwarded to the Miami field office for further investigation. That did not happen. The information was not followed by an investigation at the time. This failure became one of the central questions surrounding Parkland. Could the shooting have been prevented if the warning had been handled correctly? The answer cannot be established with certainty. No one can reconstruct an alternate February 14th and know exactly what a different investigative response would have produced. What can be established is that the FBI acknowledged a serious procedural failure in handling the January 5th information. This distinction between what is known and what can only be imagined would remain important throughout the aftermath. The Parkland story, therefore, has several layers. At its center is an act of mass violence in which 17 people were killed and 17 others were wounded. Around that central fact are the history of a former student, the warnings that existed before the attack, the investigative effort that followed, the criminal charges, and the later debate over punishment. But none of those layers should obscure the people at the center of the tragedy. February 14th was supposed to be an ordinary day. Instead, it became the day 17 families lost someone they loved. It became the day 17 survivors were wounded. It became the day a school community was permanently changed. And it became the beginning of years of investigation, litigation, and public examination. The first responsibility in telling the story is therefore to remember what was lost before asking how it happened. 17 people entered that school as students and staff members. They did not leave. The next chapters of the story would attempt to explain how the warning signs, the former student's history, and the events of that afternoon came together. But no explanation can undo the simplest and most painful fact. On February 14th, 2018, an ordinary school day ended in the deaths of 17 people, and the consequences of those deaths would continue long after the gunfire stopped. Long before February 14th, 2018, Nicholas Cruz had already come to the attention of people and institutions around him. His history was not a simple one, and it would be misleading to turn that history into a single explanation for what happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Cruz had experienced behavioral and social adjustment difficulties from an early age. According to the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Commission, he received support from mental health professionals beginning at approximately 11 years old and continuing until he was 18. During his years at school, he also experienced disciplinary problems. Eventually, his relationship with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School ended in 2017 when he was expelled. By the time he returned to the campus on February 14, 2018, he was therefore not simply another member of the student body. He was a former student whose history at the school had already included serious disciplinary concerns. But understanding those facts requires caution. A history of behavioral difficulties does not establish that a person will commit mass violence. Mental health treatment does not establish that mental illness caused a crime. And disciplinary problems, even serious ones, cannot by themselves predict exactly what someone will do in the future. The significance of Cruz's background emerged only after the shooting, when investigators and the public began looking backward and asking whether there had been warning signs that could have been recognized earlier. One of the most important pieces of that history involved the FBI and information received in 2017. In September of that year, the FBI received information concerning a comment posted on YouTube in which the writer threatened to become a school shooter. Investigators examined the information. They attempted to determine who had made the comment, but they could not identify the person behind it. Without that identification, the investigation did not establish a direct connection to Cruz. The inquiry was eventually closed in October 2017. This detail later became significant because the comment was discussed after the Parkland attack as one of several warnings that had existed before the massacre. But it is essential not to rewrite the historical record with knowledge gained afterward. The FBI did not know at the time that the person behind the comment would attack Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Investigators could not identify the individual responsible for the comment. There is therefore no factual basis for saying that the FBI knowingly identified Cruz as an imminent school shooter and then chose to ignore him. The situation was more complicated. The information existed. Investigators examined it. They were unable to identify the person responsible, and the investigation was closed. That episode would later become part of a much larger examination of how warning information is received and evaluated. The more direct warning came only a few months later. On January 5, 2018, a person acquainted with Cruz contacted the FBI's tip line. This call came just over 1 month before the shooting. The caller raised several concerns about Cruz. The information included concerns about his possession of guns, statements about wanting to kill people, erratic behavior, troubling material on social media, and the possibility that he might carry out a school shooting. This was not simply a vague expression of unease. The information specifically identified Cruz and described behavior that, after February 14th, would appear extraordinarily serious. Yet at the time, the warning did not result in a follow-up investigation. The FBI later acknowledged that this was a serious procedural failure. The information should have been assessed as a potential threat to life and forwarded to the FBI's Miami field office for further investigation. That did not occur. The information did not reach the office that should have handled the investigation, and no further investigation was initiated based on the call at that time. This became one of the defining questions of the Parkland aftermath. The question was not simply whether someone had warned authorities. Someone had. The question was what happened to that warning after it was received. Information is only useful if it reaches the people responsible for evaluating it. A warning that remains inside a system without being properly assessed cannot perform the function for which the system exists. The FBI's acknowledgement of the failure, therefore, became an important part of the official examination of the shooting. But even with that acknowledgement, one question could not be answered definitively. Would a proper response have prevented the attack? It is tempting to look backward and assume that the answer must be yes. The warning contained information that, after the shooting, appeared to describe a dangerous possibility with remarkable clarity. But hindsight changes how information looks. Before the shooting, investigators did not possess knowledge of the future. They did not know that Cruz would enter Building 12 on February 14th. They did not know that 17 people would be killed and 17 others wounded. They did not know that the person described in the warning would become responsible for one of the most serious school shootings in American history. A proper investigation might have uncovered additional evidence. It might have led to intervention, but there is no factual way to prove exactly what would have happened. The responsible conclusion is therefore narrower. The FBI failed to follow the appropriate procedure for handling the January 5th information, and the consequences of that failure became a major issue after the shooting. That distinction matters because it separates documented facts from speculation. The warnings were only one part of Cruz's history. His former school had already dealt with disciplinary issues involving him. His behavior had drawn attention. He had received professional support for years. He had eventually been expelled in 2017. Yet none of these circumstances, individually, provided certainty about what he would later do. A person can display troubling behavior without committing mass violence. A person can require mental health support without becoming violent. A student can be expelled without later becoming a murderer. The tragedy of Parkland cannot therefore be reduced to a checklist of warning signs. What made the case so disturbing was the combination of multiple concerns with the eventual reality of what happened. After the shooting, investigators had to reconstruct that history and determine which information had been available, who had received it, and what had been done with it. The investigation also examined Cruz's online activity, relationships, school history, and access to weapons. The goal was to understand both the attack itself and the circumstances surrounding it. This process revealed that Cruz had not appeared suddenly from nowhere on February 14th. He had a history, people had interacted with him, institutions had recorded concerns, and at least one specific warning had reached the FBI shortly before the massacre. But a history of concerns is not the same as a proven prediction. The distinction would become especially important in discussions about responsibility. Cruz was ultimately responsible for the murders and attempted murders he committed. He later pleaded guilty to all 34 charges. The existence of warnings before the crime did not transfer that responsibility to someone else. At the same time, Cruz's responsibility did not eliminate the institutional obligation to examine whether warnings had been handled properly. Both realities could exist at once. The FBI could acknowledge a procedural failure, while Cruz remained fully responsible for his actions. The school and other agencies could examine their own response while the criminal case against Cruz proceeded independently. This separation between individual responsibility and institutional accountability became central to the aftermath. The warning on January 5th would never be able to answer the question of what might have happened if it had been properly investigated. It could only demonstrate what actually happened. The warning was received. The required follow-up did not occur, and 39 days later Cruz returned to his former school. On February 14th, at approximately 2:19 p.m., he arrived at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Around 2:21 p.m., he entered Building 12. Within seconds, the shooting began. The distance between the warning and the attack was now measured not only in weeks but in the knowledge of what those weeks contained. For investigators looking backward, January 5th became a critical date. For the people who died, it was part of a future they would never experience. The warning had existed. The information had been received. The opportunity for further investigation had existed as well. What could never be established was whether that opportunity would have changed the outcome. That uncertainty became one of the most painful aspects of the Parkland story. It offered neither the certainty of prevention nor the comfort of inevitability. Instead, it left a documented institutional failure alongside an unknowable alternative future. And as the investigation moved forward, the focus would shift from what had been known before the shooting to what happened during those crucial minutes inside Building 12, how Cruz escaped the immediate scene, and how investigators eventually located him in Coral Springs. The warnings had raised the first major questions. The attack itself would provide the answers to others, written in the evidence left behind by the 17 people who died, the 17 who survived, and the former student whose actions transformed February 14th forever. Long before February 14th, 2018, there had already been moments in Nicholas Cruz's life that drew attention to his behavior. They did not form a simple, perfectly connected chain leading inevitably toward the tragedy at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. They were pieces of information separated across years and circumstances, and only after the shooting did investigators, officials, and the public begin to examine them together. That distinction matters. Looking backward, it is tempting to believe that the outcome was obvious, that every warning was a clear prediction of what was coming. But the available facts do not support such certainty. What they show is something more complicated. A young man with documented behavioral and social adjustment problems. a history of disciplinary difficulties, and in the months immediately before the attack, warnings that raised serious concerns about the possibility of violence. Cruz was born in Florida in 1998. According to the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Commission, concerns about his behavior and social adjustment had appeared while he was still young. He received assistance from mental health professionals beginning at approximately the age of 11, and that support continued until he was 18. These facts later became an important part of discussions surrounding his background and the legal proceedings. But they must be handled carefully. Receiving mental health support does not establish that mental illness caused the shooting, nor does it by itself explain why someone commits an act of extreme violence. Psychological difficulties, behavioral problems, and criminal responsibility are different questions. In Cruz's case, those questions would eventually be examined during the legal process. But the existence of treatment should not be transformed into a simplistic explanation for the massacre. During his years at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, Cruz also developed a record of disciplinary problems. The school was not an unfamiliar place to him. It was an institution where he had once been a student, and that connection would later become central to the events of February 14th. By 2017, his problems at school had become serious enough that he was expelled. From that point forward, he was no longer a student walking through the same hallways as the people he would later encounter. He was a former student, yet the story of what happened before the shooting does not end with his expulsion. In September 2017, several months before the massacre, the FBI received information concerning a comment on YouTube that contained a threat to become a school shooter. The FBI examined the information. Investigators were unable to identify the person behind the comment, and the investigation was closed in October 2017. In retrospect, that information became significant because the shooting that followed would take place at a school. But it is important not to erase the uncertainty that existed at the time. The fact that the FBI received a threatening comment does not mean investigators knew that Cruz was the person responsible. And it does not mean they knew that an attack at Marjory Stoneman Douglas was being planned. The information was investigated, but the person behind it could not be identified. The investigation was then closed. That episode would later become one part of a much larger examination of whether warning signs had been missed. Then came January 5, 2018. Just over a month before the shooting, a person acquainted with Cruz contacted the FBI's tip line. This time, the information was not simply an anonymous statement on a website. The caller raised concerns specifically about Cruz. According to the supplied information, the caller warned that Cruz possessed guns, had spoken about wanting to kill people, behaved erratically, and had troubling material on social media. The caller also expressed concern that Cruz could carry out a school shooting. It is difficult to look at those warnings after February 14th without feeling the weight of what they contained. But again, the most important fact is not that the future somehow became visible in January. It is that information concerning a potential threat reached the FBI and was not processed according to the proper procedure. The FBI later acknowledged that the information should have been assessed as a potential threat to life and forwarded to the Miami field office for further investigation. That did not happen. There was no follow-up investigation into the information at that time. This failure became one of the most consequential questions surrounding the case. The issue was not simply whether someone had warned authorities. The issue was what happened to that warning after it was received. A warning has value only if the system is capable of recognizing its significance, passing it to the appropriate people, and acting on it when necessary. In this case, that chain was broken. Yet even here, caution is necessary. It cannot be established with certainty that a proper response to the January 5th information would have prevented the attack. There is no way to reconstruct an alternate February 14th and know exactly what would have happened if the warning had been investigated differently. What can be established is narrower and more concrete. The FBI acknowledged that the information was not handled according to procedure. that it should have been forwarded to the Miami field office, and that no follow-up investigation occurred at the time. This distinction between what is known and what cannot be known is essential when examining the case. The temptation in any investigation of a catastrophe is to create a straight line backward from the final event. Every earlier incident can begin to look like a prediction. Every troubling behavior can appear to have been an unmistakable signal. But real investigations are rarely that simple. Before February 14th, Cruz's history consisted of separate episodes. Behavioral concerns during childhood, years of professional support, disciplinary difficulties at school, his eventual expulsion, a threatening YouTube comment that the FBI could not conclusively connect to him, and finally the January 5th warning that specifically identified him. Together, these facts created a troubling background, but they did not provide investigators with the ability to see the future with certainty. By early February 2018, however, the clock was moving toward a day that no one around Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School understood would become a dividing line in their lives. Inside the school, students continued their education. Teachers and coaches continued their work. The people who would become the 17 dead and 17 wounded were still living ordinary lives. Outside the school, the information about Cruz existed within records and memories. But the warnings had not stopped what was coming. The tragedy of Parkland would eventually force difficult questions about how institutions respond when concerning information arrives, how separate warnings are connected, and how much responsibility can be placed on a system after a failure becomes visible only in hindsight. But on January 5th, those questions had not yet been answered. February 14th had not yet arrived. The people inside Building 12 did not know what was approaching. And Cruz, the former student who had already generated warnings and disciplinary concerns, was still outside the school. Within weeks, that would change. The next chapter would begin not with a warning, but with a journey back to a familiar place on Valentine's Day, 2018. February 14th, 2018, began as Valentine's Day, a date normally associated with affection, friendship, and ordinary expressions of care. At Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, it was a school day like any other until the events of that afternoon transformed the campus into the scene of one of the most serious school shootings in American history. The people inside the school did not know what was coming. Among them were students whose names would later become inseparable from the tragedy. Alissa Alhadeff, Martin Duquenguiano, Nicolas Dvoret, Jaime Gutenberg, Luke Oyer, Cara Logran, Gina Montalto, Joaquin Oliver, Alaina Petty, Alex Schachter, Carmen Eschentrup, Peter Wong, Meadow Pollock, and Helena Ramsey. There were also teachers and staff members, including Scott Beigel, Aaron Fays, and Chris Hickson. By the end of the afternoon, all 17 would be dead, and 17 other people would have survived gunshot wounds. The sequence that led to that outcome began shortly after 2 o'clock. According to the timeline provided by investigators, at approximately 2:06 p.m., 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz was picked up by an Uber. Cruz was a former student of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. He had been expelled from the school in 2017 following disciplinary problems. But on this afternoon, he was returning to the campus. At approximately 2:19 p.m., the Uber dropped him at the school. 2 minutes later, at around 2:21 p.m., Cruz entered Building 12. The building contained multiple classrooms, and within seconds of his entering, the shooting began. What followed unfolded in a matter of minutes. Cruz moved through different parts of the building and fired at students and staff. The attack was rapid, and the people inside the building were suddenly confronted with a threat that had not been part of their expectations when the school day began. There is an important reason to describe these moments without unnecessary graphic detail. The essential facts are already devastating. Cruz entered the building, the shooting began, and people inside were killed and wounded. The FBI's account identifies a total of 34 people who were shot during the attack. 17 died. 17 survived. Within that larger number were individuals whose roles had placed them in different parts of the school community. Scott Beigel was a teacher and coach. During the attack, he helped students get into a classroom for protection. Aaron Faze was a football coach and security staff member who was credited with protecting students. Chris Hickson was the school's athletic director and also a member of the security staff. Their presence in the school that day reflected the responsibilities they normally carried, but the circumstances had suddenly changed. The school was no longer simply a place for classes, athletics, and daily routines. It had become an emergency in which students and staff were trying to find safety. The attack continued through Building 12. Crews moved through different areas and fired into classrooms and hallways. Because the event happened so quickly, the timeline is measured in minutes. By approximately 2:27 p.m., crews had abandoned the gun and backpack and left the building. That moment did not mean the emergency was over. 17 people had already lost their lives, 17 others had been wounded, and the person responsible was still at large. Approximately 2 minutes later, at around 2:29 p.m., crews blended into the students who were fleeing the school. This detail became significant because it meant that the suspected attacker was no longer visibly separated from the people escaping the danger. The response was now moving beyond the building itself. Students were leaving the school, and authorities were dealing with the aftermath while trying to determine where the attacker had gone. Crews had succeeded in leaving Building 12 without being immediately arrested. The tragedy inside the building had already occurred, but the search for the person responsible was continuing. The supplied timeline places the beginning of the shooting at approximately 2:21 p.m., while the FBI has also described the incident as beginning around 2:30 p.m. The difference reflects the varying precision of different official timelines, with the detailed investigative chronology recording events by specific minutes and seconds. What remains clear is that the attack took place during a very short period in the early afternoon. The violence inside the school was measured in minutes, but its consequences would last for years. After leaving the school, Cruz did not immediately disappear from the area. Instead, he walked away from the campus. At approximately 2:50 p.m., he appeared at a Walmart. Later, at around 3:01 p.m., he went to a McDonald's. These movements would become part of the timeline investigators reconstructed after his arrest. The contrast is stark. At the school, students and staff were dealing with the aftermath of a mass shooting. Outside the campus, Cruz was moving through the surrounding area. The investigation would later establish these locations and times as part of the effort to understand what happened after he left the building. Meanwhile, the emergency response at the school continued. The number of victims was becoming clear, and the scope of the tragedy was emerging. 17 people had been killed, 17 others had been shot and survived. The victims were students and members of staff, people whose lives had been connected to the same school. The names that had been introduced earlier in this story now became part of a crime scene investigation, and eventually a criminal case. The next question was no longer simply what had happened inside Building 12. It was where Cruz was and whether he could be found before he escaped the area. The answer came approximately 75 minutes after the shooting began. At around 3:41 p.m., a police officer discovered Cruz in Coral Springs. He was arrested without a gunfight at the time of his capture. The search that had begun after the shooting had ended with the suspect in custody. But the arrest did not end the case. In many ways, it marked the beginning of the next phase. Investigators would now have to reconstruct the attack, establish the sequence of events, examine evidence, speak with survivors, review surveillance footage and communications, and determine what had happened before the shooting. They would also have to examine Cruz's history, including the disciplinary problems that had led to his expulsion from the school and the warnings that had reached authorities before February 14th. The immediate crisis was over, but the questions were only beginning. How had Cruz entered the school? What exactly had happened during those critical minutes inside Building 12? How had he left the scene? And perhaps most importantly, how had the former student who had generated warnings before the attack reached the point of carrying out the violence? Those questions would become the foundation of the investigation. Yet before investigators could fully examine them, there was one fact that could not be changed or explained away. 17 people were dead, 17 more were wounded, and an ordinary Valentine's Day at a Florida high school had become a permanent dividing line for hundreds of families and for the wider community. The attack had lasted only minutes. The consequences would not. The shooting inside Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School lasted only minutes. But the search for Nicholas Cruz continued long after he left Building 12. By approximately 2:27 p.m., Cruz had abandoned the gun and backpack and walked away from the building. Around 2:29 p.m., he blended into the students fleeing the school. For the people still trying to understand what had happened, the immediate danger inside the building was only one part of the emergency. The person responsible was no longer where the shooting had taken place. He was somewhere outside the school, moving through the surrounding area while police and other responders were dealing with the aftermath. The next 75 minutes would become an important part of the reconstruction of the case. Cruz did not immediately leave the wider area. According to the timeline supplied for this account, he walked away from the school and later appeared at a Walmart at approximately 2:50 p.m. The detail is significant because it places him outside the school only a short time after the attack. At the school itself, the consequences were already becoming clear. 17 people had been killed, 17 others had been shot and survived. Students and staff were being removed from the area, and authorities were attempting to determine the identity and location of the person responsible. Cruz, meanwhile, continued moving through the surrounding community. At approximately 3:01 p.m., he went to a McDonald's. These movements would later become part of the investigative timeline, allowing authorities to reconstruct where he had gone after leaving Building 12. They also demonstrated that the search for the suspect extended beyond the immediate school grounds. The emergency was no longer confined to a single building. Law enforcement now had to locate a person who had left the scene and could potentially be anywhere in the surrounding area. The FBI's account describes Cruz as attempting to blend into the students who were escaping from the school. That detail helps explain why his immediate disappearance from the scene was possible. The school was filled with people trying to get away from danger, and Cruz was no longer standing apart from them as the obvious former student who had entered Building 12. He had left the building and was moving away with others. The distinction between the attacker and the people fleeing the attack was therefore not immediately visible. Yet the investigation was already beginning to take shape. Officers and investigators had a crime scene to secure, victims to identify, survivors to speak with, and a suspect to locate. The information available from the school would eventually have to be combined with information from outside the school. Surveillance footage, communications, witness accounts, and the movements of the suspect would all become pieces of the same reconstruction. At this stage, however, the priority was finding Cruz. Approximately 75 minutes after the shooting began, the search ended. At around 3:41 p.m., a police officer discovered Cruz in Coral Springs. He was arrested without a gunfight at the time of his capture. The arrest brought an immediate end to the search for the suspected shooter, but it did not answer the questions created by the massacre. Instead, it gave investigators the opportunity to begin asking them directly and systematically. Cruz was now in custody. The school remained the scene of a mass killing. 17 victims were dead. 17 others had survived gunshot wounds. And investigators needed to establish exactly how the attack had unfolded. The first stage of that work involved reconstructing the chronology. Investigators had to establish when Cruz arrived, when he entered Building 12, when the shooting began, when he left, and where he went afterward. The known timeline provided several anchors: 2:06 p.m., when the Uber picked him up, 2:19 p.m., when he arrived at the school, approximately 2:21 p.m., when he entered Building 12, Approximately 2:27 p.m., when he abandoned the gun and backpack and left the building. Approximately 2:29 p.m., when he blended into fleeing students. Approximately 2:50 p.m., when he appeared at Walmart. Approximately 3:01 p.m., when he went to McDonald's, and 3:41 p.m., when he was arrested in Coral Springs. Each time point became part of a larger sequence. Investigators also examined the evidence at the school. The investigation focused on the physical evidence from the scene, accounts from survivors, surveillance footage, and communications involving the agencies responding to the emergency. The purpose was not simply to prove that Cruz had been present. His arrest had already established that he was in custody. The larger task was to reconstruct the attack in sufficient detail to understand what happened and to build the criminal case that would follow. Investigators also began looking backward. Cruz's history became relevant because the shooting did not occur in complete isolation from everything that had come before it. He had been a student at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School and had been expelled in 2017 because of disciplinary problems. He had a documented history of behavioral and social adjustment difficulties, and he had received professional mental health support beginning at approximately age 11 and continuing until age 18. These facts became part of the broader investigation, but they did not provide a simple explanation for the crime. The investigators also had to examine his activity on social media and other information concerning his behavior before February 14th. This was particularly important because authorities already knew that warnings about Cruz had existed before the shooting. One of those warnings had reached the FBI on January 5, 2018. The caller had expressed concerns about Cruz possessing guns, speaking about wanting to kill people, behaving erratically, and displaying troubling material on social media. The caller had also raised the possibility that Cruz could carry out a school shooting. After the massacre, the importance of that call became impossible to ignore. The FBI acknowledged that the information should have been treated as a potential threat to life and forwarded to the Miami field office for further investigation. Instead, that did not happen. There was no follow-up investigation into the information at that time. This became one of the central institutional questions surrounding the case. The issue was not whether the FBI had been given an exact prediction of February 14th. The available information does not establish that, nor does it establish that a proper response would certainly have prevented the shooting. What it does establish is that a warning concerning Cruz had reached the FBI and that the information was not processed according to the appropriate procedure. Investigators also had to look further back to September 2017, when the FBI received information about a YouTube comment containing a threat to become a school shooter. That information was investigated, but the person behind the comment could not be identified, and the investigation was closed in October. Again, hindsight made the information more significant, but significance after the fact is not the same as certainty beforehand. The investigation therefore developed along two parallel paths. One path moved forward from the shooting, crime scene evidence, surveillance footage, witness accounts, victim information, and Cruz's movements after leaving Building 12. The other moved backward, his school history, disciplinary problems, behavioral concerns, social media activity, and warnings received by authorities. Eventually, these paths would meet in the courtroom. The prosecution would have to establish the criminal charges against Cruz, while the defense would address the circumstances surrounding him and the question of punishment. But before any courtroom could consider those questions, investigators had to establish the basic facts of the case. Cruz had been at the school. He had entered Building 12. The shooting had begun shortly afterward. 17 people had been killed, and 17 had been wounded. He had left the building, moved away from the school, and was arrested approximately 75 minutes after the attack began. Those facts provided the foundation. The investigation then became broader and more difficult. It was no longer only about what Cruz had done on February 14th. It was also about what authorities knew before that day, what they did with the information they received, and what could reasonably have been understood from the warnings available at the time. The answers would never change what happened inside Building 12, but they would shape how Parkland was understood afterward, not only as a mass shooting committed by one former student, but also as a case that forced institutions to examine how warning signs are recognized, communicated, investigated, and acted upon before violence occurs. The next stage would move from evidence and chronology toward the question of motive, responsibility, and the law. Cruz was in custody. The investigation had reconstructed the basic sequence. The next question was what would happen to him in court. By the time Nicholas Cruz was in custody, the central facts of the Parkland shooting were no longer in doubt. He had returned to Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School on February 14, 2018, entered Building 12, and carried out an attack that killed 17 people and wounded 17 others. He had then left the building, blended into the students fleeing the school, moved through the surrounding area, and was arrested approximately 75 minutes after the shooting began. But establishing what happened is not the same as explaining why it happened. Once the immediate investigation had established the basic sequence of events, attention turned toward Cruz's background, his behavior, his psychological history, and the circumstances that had surrounded him before the shooting. These questions would later become especially important in court. There were also questions that demanded caution. There was a strong temptation to find a single explanation for an act of violence on such a scale. Perhaps there was one event, one psychological problem, one relationship, or one moment that could explain everything. But the information available in this case does not support such a simple conclusion. Instead, it describes a complicated history involving behavioral difficulties, social adjustment problems, disciplinary issues, mental health treatment, social isolation, troubling behavior, and warnings received by authorities. None of those facts, individually or collectively, can be presented as a complete explanation for why Cruz committed the shooting. Cruz was born in Florida in 1998. According to the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Commission, behavioral and social adjustment problems had been documented from an early age. He received assistance from mental health professionals beginning at approximately 11 years old, and that support continued until he was 18. This history later became relevant to discussions of his psychological state and to the legal proceedings. But the existence of mental health treatment does not establish that mental illness caused the shooting. That distinction is particularly important in a case like this, where there can be a tendency to connect psychological difficulties directly to extreme violence. The facts do not justify such a conclusion. Mental health problems and criminal responsibility are separate issues, and the court would ultimately have to consider Cruz's legal responsibility for the crimes rather than simply his personal history. His years at Marjory Stoneman Douglas also included disciplinary problems. Eventually, in 2017, he was expelled from the school. That decision changed his relationship with the institution. He was no longer a student there when he returned on February 14, 2018. He was a former student entering a place he had once attended. His previous connection to the school, therefore, became an important part of the context surrounding the attack. Investigators also examined information about his behavior and activity before February 14th. The supplied information identifies concerns about social isolation, violent thoughts and behavior, family relationships, and material appearing on social media. These issues were examined during the investigation and later became relevant to arguments made during the legal proceedings. But again, they should not be transformed into a single, definitive motive when the available facts do not establish one. The same caution applies to the warnings that had reached authorities. In September 2017, the FBI had received information about a YouTube comment threatening to become a school shooter. Investigators examined the information but could not identify the person responsible, and the investigation was closed in October. Then, on January 5, 2018, a person acquainted with Cruz contacted the FBI and raised much more specific concerns about him. The caller described Cruz as someone who possessed guns, spoke about wanting to kill people, behaved erratically, and had troubling social media material. The caller also expressed concern that Cruz could carry out a school shooting. The FBI later acknowledged that the information should have been assessed and forwarded to the Miami field office for further investigation. That did not happen. The warning was not followed by an investigation at the time. This failure would become one of the most important institutional issues surrounding the case. But it was not itself a legal explanation for Cruz's conduct. It was evidence of a failure in the handling of information. The question of responsibility for the shooting remained with Cruz. That distinction would become especially important once the case entered the courtroom. Cruz was charged with 17 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and 17 counts of attempted first-degree murder. The 34 charges corresponded directly to the 34 people who had been shot during the attack, 17 who died and 17 who survived. Because Florida law allowed the death penalty for certain especially serious murders, the case became a capital case. The legal process therefore moved beyond the question of whether Cruz had committed the shooting. The central questions would eventually become his legal responsibility and the appropriate punishment. On October 20th, 2021, Cruz pleaded guilty to all 34 charges. His decision meant that there would no longer be a trial in which the prosecution had to prove that he was the person who carried out the shooting. The guilty plea established his responsibility for all 34 offenses. But it did not end the legal proceedings. Instead, the case entered its next and perhaps most emotionally difficult stage, determining whether Cruz would receive the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The penalty phase would require the court to consider not simply the crimes themselves, which were already established through the guilty plea, but also the circumstances surrounding Cruz and the arguments presented by both sides. The prosecution sought the death penalty. The defense sought life imprisonment without parole. Psychological and personal circumstances became part of the defense's argument, while prosecutors emphasized the deliberate nature of the crimes and the devastating consequences suffered by the victims and their families. The distinction between explanation and excuse became particularly important. A person's background can be examined without being treated as a justification for what that person did. The existence of behavioral problems, mental health treatment, social difficulties, or a troubled history does not erase responsibility for 17 murders and 17 attempted murders. At the same time, those factors could be considered within the legal process when determining punishment. That was the task facing the court. The victims' families also became an important part of the proceedings. Their experiences represented the consequences of the crimes in a way that no forensic report or legal document could fully capture. 17 people had been killed, and 17 others had been wounded. The families had lost children, relatives, friends, teachers, coaches, and members of their community. Their presence in the penalty proceedings ensured that the case could not be reduced to an abstract debate over legal punishment. The question of what should happen to Cruz existed alongside the much larger reality of what had happened to everyone else. By the time the penalty phase began, the facts surrounding the attack had been established. Cruz had returned to his former school. He had entered Building 12. He had killed 17 people and wounded 17 others. He had left the scene and been arrested. He had subsequently admitted responsibility by pleading guilty to all 34 charges. What remained unresolved was the punishment. The prosecution would argue for death. The defense would argue for life without parole. And behind those arguments stood the 17 victims whose families would now have an opportunity to speak about the consequences of the crimes. The courtroom would become the final setting in which the story of February 14th was examined. But unlike the investigation, which had focused on reconstructing the past, the penalty phase was focused on the future. What sentence should be imposed on the person responsible, and whether the state of Florida should ultimately take his life. That decision would not be made by a single piece of evidence or by a simple calculation. It would depend on the arguments presented, the circumstances considered, and ultimately the decision of the jury. The answer would arrive in October 2022, when the jurors would confront the final question of the case, death or life without parole. By the time the penalty phase of Nicholas Cruz's case began, there was no longer a question about whether he had been responsible for the attack at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. On October 20th, 2021, Cruz had pleaded guilty to all 34 charges against him. 17 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and 17 counts of attempted first-degree murder. The guilty plea removed the need for a trial to establish whether Cruz was the person who had carried out the shooting. He had accepted responsibility for the crimes in court. But the most consequential question remained unanswered. What punishment should follow? The prosecution sought the death penalty. The defense argued for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the families of the 17 people who had been killed, the question was not theoretical. It was the final stage of a case that had begun with a few minutes of violence and had continued through years of grief, investigation, public scrutiny, and legal proceedings. The penalty phase lasted approximately 3 months. During that period, the court examined the circumstances surrounding Cruz and the consequences of his crimes. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate nature of the killings and the scale of the destruction. 17 people had died. 17 others had been wounded. The victims included 14 students and 3 members of the school staff. Their ages ranged from 14 to 49. Some had only recently entered high school. Others were nearing graduation. The adults had been teachers, coaches, athletic staff, and security personnel. The consequences extended far beyond the walls of Building 12. Families had lost children and loved ones. Students had lost classmates. The school had lost members of its community. The defense, meanwhile, sought to persuade the jury that Cruz should receive life without parole rather than death. His background and psychological circumstances became part of that argument. The defense presented information concerning his personal history and mental state, asking jurors to consider the circumstances that had shaped him. This was consistent with the distinction that had already emerged during the case. Understanding a person's history is not the same as excusing what that person did. Cruz's behavioral and social adjustment difficulties had been documented from an early age. He had received professional mental health support beginning at approximately 11 and continuing until 18. He had experienced disciplinary problems at school and had ultimately been expelled from Marjory Stoneman Douglas in 2017. These facts did not change the reality of the crimes, but they were relevant to the defense's argument about punishment. The prosecution focused on another reality. Whatever circumstances had existed in Cruz's background, 17 people were dead and 17 more had survived being shot. The penalty phase, therefore, placed 2 different kinds of information before the jury. On one side was the scale and deliberate nature of the crime. On the other was the defense's effort to explain Cruz's background and psychological circumstances. Between those arguments stood the jurors, who would ultimately determine whether the death penalty could be recommended under the law applicable to the case. The families of the victims were not silent observers during this process. They were given the opportunity to provide victim impact statements. These statements allowed them to describe the consequences of the killings and the absence left behind by the deaths. The legal process had spent years examining Cruz, his history, his behavior, the shooting, the evidence, and his responsibility. The victim impact statements shifted the focus back toward the people whose lives had been taken. Their presence in the courtroom was a reminder that the case was not simply about what would happen to Cruz. It was also about what had already happened to everyone who had been affected by the attack. The 17 people who died could not return to their families. The 17 people who survived their gunshot wounds could not erase what had happened. The school community could not return to the morning of February 14th, 2018, as though nothing had occurred. The legal system could determine a sentence, but it could not reverse the underlying loss. As the penalty phase progressed, the possibility of a death sentence remained central. Florida law allowed capital punishment in cases of this nature, and the prosecution was asking the jury to impose it. For the families who believed that Cruz deserved death, the possibility represented the strongest punishment available under the law. But the decision required the jury to reach the level of agreement required by Florida law at the time. On October 13, 2022, that decision arrived. The jury voted 9-3 in favor of the death penalty. 9 jurors supported a death sentence. 3 did not. In another context, 9 votes might appear overwhelming. Here, however, they were not enough. The law applicable to Cruz's case required unanimous agreement for a death recommendation. Because 3 jurors did not agree to the death penalty, the necessary unanimity did not exist. The result was therefore decisive, even though the vote itself was divided. Cruz would not receive a death sentence. The decision provoked anger and disappointment among many of the victims' families, some of whom had wanted Cruz to be executed. For them, the fact that 9 jurors favored death did not lessen the significance of the 3 who opposed it. The law required unanimity, and unanimity had not been reached. The legal process, therefore, moved toward the only outcome available under those circumstances: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The final sentencing took place on November 2, 2022. Judge Elizabeth Scherer sentenced Cruz to 17 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the 17 murders. He also received 17 additional consecutive life sentences for the 17 counts of attempted murder. Altogether, Cruz received 34 life sentences. The sentence ensured that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life under the terms of the judgment. The courtroom proceedings had reached their formal conclusion, but the emotional conclusion was much less clear. A sentence can establish a legal consequence. It cannot restore the dead. It cannot remove the pain of a parent who lost a child. It cannot return a teacher or coach to a school community. It cannot erase the experience of those who survived being shot. The punishment could only answer one narrow question: what would happen to the person responsible for the crimes? The victim's family still had to answer a much harder question in their own lives: how to continue living with what had happened. The final outcome also became inseparable from the earlier questions surrounding the case. Before the shooting, there had been disciplinary concerns about Cruz. There had been a history of behavioral and social adjustment problems. There had been the September 2017 FBI information concerning a YouTube threat that investigators could not connect to a specific person. And there had been the January 5, 2018 call to the FBI warning specifically about Cruz, including concerns about guns, statements about wanting to kill people, erratic behavior, troubling social media material, and the possibility of a school shooting. The FBI later acknowledged that the January information should have been assessed and forwarded to the Miami field office for further investigation. But that did not happen. None of these facts changed the verdict because there was no trial over whether Cruz committed the shooting. His guilty plea had already established his responsibility for the 34 charges. But they remained part of the larger story of Parkland and the questions that followed. The legal process had determined Cruz's fate. The death penalty had not been imposed. Instead, he would spend the remainder of his life in prison without parole. The case that had begun with 17 deaths had reached its formal judicial conclusion with 34 life sentences. Yet for the people who had lost someone on February 14, 2018, the end of the courtroom proceedings could never be the end of the story. There was still the question of what the institutions had known before the attack, what they had failed to do, and what could be learned from the failure. There was also the question of how a community moves forward after losing 17 of its members and seeing 17 others wounded. The courtroom had delivered an answer about Cruz's punishment. It could not deliver an answer about how to undo the past. That question would remain outside the courthouse, in the lives of the survivors, the families, the school, and the institutions forced to examine their own failures. The sentence was final. The consequences were not. The sentencing of Nicholas Cruz on November 2nd, 2022, brought the formal criminal case to its conclusion, but it did not bring an end to the consequences of the Parkland shooting. Cruz had been sentenced to 17 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole for the 17 murders, along with 17 additional consecutive life terms for the 17 attempted murders. In total, he received 34 consecutive life sentences. The legal question of what would happen to Cruz had been answered. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. But for the families of the victims, the survivors, and the wider community, another set of questions remained. Those questions were not about whether Cruz had committed the shooting. He had pleaded guilty to all 34 charges. They were about what had happened before February 14, 2018, what warnings had existed, how those warnings had been handled, and what could be learned from the failure to prevent the tragedy. The Parkland case, therefore, became more than a criminal prosecution. It became an examination of systems. One of the most important issues concerned the FBI and the warning received on January 5, 2018. A person acquainted with Cruz had contacted the FBI's tip line and raised concerns about him. The information included Cruz's possession of guns, statements about wanting to kill people, erratic behavior, troubling material on social media, and the possibility that he could carry out a school shooting. After the massacre, the FBI acknowledged that this information should have been treated as a potential threat to life and forwarded to the Miami field office for further investigation. That did not happen. No follow-up investigation concerning that information took place at the time. The significance of this failure became difficult to separate from the events that followed. The warning had arrived slightly more than a month before Cruz returned to his former school. It contained several elements that, viewed afterward, appeared deeply concerning. Yet it is equally important not to claim that the shooting could definitely have been prevented if the warning had been handled correctly. There is no way to know with certainty what would have happened under different circumstances. A proper investigation might have produced additional information, or it might not have. It might have identified a way to intervene, or it might not have. The facts establish the procedural failure, but they do not establish an alternate history. This distinction is essential because hindsight can create an illusion of inevitability. Once a tragedy has happened, earlier warnings can appear obvious and decisive. Before the tragedy, however, institutions have to evaluate incomplete information and make decisions without knowing what the future holds. The Parkland case demonstrated the consequences that can follow when an important warning is not processed according to the required procedure. The FBI was not the only institution examined after the shooting. Reports also considered the responses of the school, law enforcement, and emergency agencies. The attack exposed questions about school security, emergency communication, employee training, and police response. These questions were not limited to the actions of one individual. They concerned how different parts of a larger system respond when a crisis begins. In an emergency, information must move quickly. People need to understand what is happening, authorities need to communicate, and responders need to act. The events at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, therefore, became a basis for recommendations intended to improve school safety, emergency communication, employee preparation, and law enforcement response. These recommendations were part of a broader effort to examine what could be changed so that future warnings and emergencies would be handled more effectively. But even after those institutional questions were raised, the human consequences remained. 17 people had died. 14 were students and 3 were school staff members. The students included freshmen who were only 14 years old and seniors who were approaching the end of high school. The adults included a teacher and coach, a football coach and security staff member, and an athletic director and security staff member. 17 additional people had been wounded and survived. The legal case could assign punishment to Cruz, but it could not restore the lives lost inside Building 12. It could not return Alyssa Alhadeff, Martin Duque Anguiano, Nicholas Dworet, Jamie Gutenberg, Luc Hoyer, Cara Logran, Gina Montalto, Joaquin Oliver, Alaina Petty, Alex Eschechte, Carmen Skintrup, Peter Wong, Meadow Pollock, Helena Ramsey, Scott Beigel, Aaron Faze, or Chris Hickson to their families and community. Their names remain at the center of the tragedy because the consequences of the shooting were measured not only in legal charges, but in human absence. The case also demonstrated why explanations must be handled carefully. Cruz's history included behavioral and social adjustment problems, disciplinary difficulties, and years of mental health support. Investigators and attorneys examined his psychological circumstances, his relationships, his social behavior, and his activity online. But none of those elements provides a single, definitive explanation for the massacre. In particular, mental health treatment should not be presented as proof that mental illness caused the violence. The facts do not support reducing the crime to one diagnosis or one aspect of Cruz's background. The responsibility for the murders and attempted murders was established through his guilty plea and the criminal judgment that followed. Understanding background circumstances and assigning criminal responsibility were separate parts of the legal process. Another layer of the aftermath involved the federal government. Survivors and families of some victims filed civil lawsuits over the FBI's handling of the warning received on January 5, 2018. In 2022, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a settlement resolving 40 civil lawsuits for a total of $127.5 million. The Department of Justice emphasized that the settlement was not an admission of legal liability by the government. The settlement nevertheless became another formal acknowledgement of the consequences surrounding the handling of the warning. It showed that the aftermath of Parkland extended beyond the criminal case against Cruz. There were questions of institutional accountability as well as individual criminal responsibility. These two forms of accountability should not be confused. Cruz was prosecuted and sentenced for the deaths and injuries he caused. The civil litigation addressed allegations concerning the government's handling of information before the shooting. One concerned the perpetrator's criminal responsibility. The other concerned institutional conduct. Together, they formed part of the broader legal aftermath of the tragedy. Years after February 14th, the central facts remain stark. A former student returned to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. He entered Building 12 and opened fire. 34 people were shot. 17 died, and 17 survived. Cruz left the building, moved through the surrounding area, and was arrested approximately 75 minutes after the shooting began. He was later charged with 34 offenses, pleaded guilty to all of them in 2021, and received 34 consecutive life sentences in 2022 after the jury failed to reach the unanimous agreement required for a death recommendation. Those facts form the legal record. But the meaning of Parkland cannot be contained entirely within that record. The case forced institutions to confront the uncomfortable space between warning and action. It demonstrated that information can exist without becoming effective intervention. It showed how difficult it is to determine, before a tragedy, which warning signs represent an immediate danger and which do not. And it left behind a lesson that cannot be reduced to a single sentence. Recognizing a warning is only the beginning. Information has to be evaluated, communicated, and acted upon according to established procedures. At the same time, the case cautions against believing that every tragedy can be explained through one missed warning or one institutional failure. The shooting was the result of Cruz's actions, and the available facts do not allow anyone to state with certainty that a different response to the January warning would have prevented what happened. That uncertainty does not make the failure unimportant. It makes the lesson more difficult and, perhaps, more important. The goal of examining Parkland is not to create a comforting story in which every tragedy has one obvious cause and one simple solution. It is to understand what is known, acknowledge what cannot be known, and identify where established procedures failed. The story also requires remembering that the victims were more than names in an investigation. They were 14 students and 3 members of a school staff who entered a school on February 14, 2018, and never returned home. Their families were left to live with a loss that no verdict could reverse. The survivors were left with injuries and memories that the passage of time could not simply erase. Cruz's sentence closed the criminal case, but it did not close their lives around what happened. In the end, Parkland is a story with several distinct layers: an act of mass violence, a history of warnings and behavioral concerns, failures in the handling of critical information, a criminal prosecution, a controversial sentencing decision, and a continuing process of institutional and personal aftermath. The most responsible way to remember it is to keep those layers separate while recognizing how they intersect. The perpetrator was held legally responsible. The institutions were forced to examine their failures. The families were left to mourn. And the names of the 17 people who died remain the clearest reminder of what was ultimately lost. The courtroom ended the question of Cruz's sentence. It could not end the questions left behind by February 14, 2018. Those questions continue to matter because the value of studying a tragedy is not in repeating its horror, but in understanding the failures surrounding it without losing sight of the people whose lives were taken. The criminal case against Nicholas Cruz ended with a sentence. But the story of Parkland did not end in the courtroom. On November 2, 2022, Cruz received 17 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the 17 murders, followed by 17 additional consecutive life sentences for the 17 attempted murders. The judgment was final in the sense that it established the punishment he would face. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. Yet the conclusion of a criminal proceeding is not the same thing as the conclusion of a tragedy. For the families of the 17 people who died, there could be no legal outcome capable of restoring what had been taken. For the 17 people who survived being shot, there could be no verdict capable of making February 14, 2018 disappear. And for the institutions responsible for protecting students and responding to threats, the Parkland shooting left a series of questions that extended far beyond the individual who committed the crimes. At the center of those questions was the warning that reached the FBI on January 5, 2018. More than a month before the shooting, a person acquainted with Cruz contacted the FBI's tip line and provided information about him. The caller raised concerns about Cruz possessing guns, speaking about wanting to kill people, behaving erratically, and displaying troubling material on social media. The caller also expressed concern that Cruz could carry out a school shooting. After the massacre, the FBI acknowledged that the information should have been evaluated as a potential threat to life and forwarded to the Miami field office for further investigation. That did not happen. There was no follow-up investigation concerning that information at the time. This failure became one of the most important parts of the aftermath because it raised a question that could never be answered with certainty. What might have happened if the information had been handled correctly? The honest answer is that no one can know. It is possible that further investigation might have uncovered information that led to intervention. It is also possible that investigators might not have found enough information to prevent the attack. The facts do not establish an alternate outcome. What they establish is that the FBI did not follow the appropriate procedure in handling the January 5 information. That distinction is crucial. Saying that the process failed is supported by the record. Saying that the failure definitely caused the shooting, or that proper action would certainly have prevented it, goes beyond what can be proven. The Parkland tragedy, therefore, became an example of the difficult gap between warning and prevention. Institutions can receive information without knowing exactly what it means. A warning can contain alarming details without providing certainty about when, where, or whether violence will occur. Yet when procedures exist for evaluating threats, those procedures are intended to make sure that potentially important information does not disappear before it can be assessed. In Cruz's case, the January warning did not reach the FBI office that should have investigated it. That fact remains significant even though the future could never be reconstructed. The earlier YouTube information raised a similar but different issue. In September 2017, the FBI received information concerning a comment threatening to become a school shooter. Investigators examined the information but could not identify the person responsible. The investigation was closed in October. After February 14th, that earlier episode became part of the public examination of what had been known before the shooting. But again, it would be inaccurate to say that authorities had identified Cruz as the person who would attack Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School and simply ignored him. The information could not be conclusively connected to him at the time. The case therefore illustrates the limits of hindsight. Once a tragedy occurs, earlier pieces of information can appear to fit together perfectly. Before the tragedy, those pieces may have been incomplete, uncertain, or impossible to connect. This is one reason the aftermath of Parkland required more than simply identifying missed warnings. It required examining how schools, law enforcement agencies, emergency responders, and other institutions communicate and act under pressure. Reports following the shooting considered issues involving school security, emergency communication, employee training, police response, and the handling of warnings about potential violence. The goal was to identify changes that could improve the ability of institutions to respond to future threats. The lessons were not limited to one individual or one agency. The shooting exposed how many parts of a response system must function together when a crisis occurs. Information has to reach the right people. Employees need appropriate training. Emergency communications have to function. Law enforcement responses have to be coordinated. Threat information has to be evaluated according to established procedures. When one part fails, the consequences can extend far beyond the original mistake. Yet even while examining systems, the story must remain centered on the victims. 17 people were killed inside the school. 14 were students: Alyssa Alhadef, Martin Duque Anguiano, Nicholas Dworet, Jamie Gutenberg, Luke Hoyer, Cara Logran, Gina Montalto, Joaquin Oliver, Alaina Petty, Alex Eschachte, Carmen Skintrup, Peter Wong, Meadow Pollock, and Helena Ramsey. 3 were members of the school staff: Scott Beigel, Aaron Faze, and Chris Hickson. Their ages ranged from 14 to 49. Their roles were different, but their lives became permanently connected through the same event. Some were freshmen, some were sophomores, and others were seniors. Some were teachers, coaches, or members of the school staff. The details matter because they prevent the victims from becoming an anonymous statistic. 17 is a number, but 17 names represent 17 individual lives. The same is true of the 17 people who survived. Their survival does not mean that the event simply ended for them when the shooting stopped. The supplied information identifies 17 people as wounded survivors, and their existence forms an important part of the aftermath. The attack produced not only deaths but injuries, disruption, grief, and consequences that extended into the lives of people who remained. The legal system addressed Cruz's responsibility, but it could not resolve all of those consequences. The civil litigation against the federal government created another avenue for examining what had happened before the shooting. Survivors and families of some victims brought lawsuits concerning the FBI's handling of the warning. In 2022, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a settlement resolving 40 civil lawsuits for a total of $127.5 million. The Department of Justice emphasized that the settlement was not an admission of legal liability by the government. That qualification matters. A settlement does not establish that every allegation in a lawsuit was proven in court. But the settlement nevertheless became a significant part of the legal aftermath, showing that the consequences of the Parkland case extended beyond Cruz's criminal sentence. There was also a broader question about how society talks about perpetrators of mass violence. Cruz's name became internationally known because of what he did, but allowing the perpetrator to dominate the narrative risks, reducing the victims to secondary characters. A responsible account has to maintain the opposite emphasis. Cruz committed the crimes and was held legally responsible for them. His background can be examined. His behavior can be studied. The failures surrounding the warnings can be investigated. But none of those subjects should overshadow the people whose lives were taken. The tragedy was not created by the victims. They did not cause it, invite it, or become responsible for it because of anything in their backgrounds. They were students and staff members who were inside their school when the attack occurred. The same principle applies to mental health discussions. Cruz had received mental health support beginning in childhood, and his psychological circumstances were examined during the legal proceedings. But mental health treatment should not be presented as the explanation for mass violence. Doing so would oversimplify the evidence and risk unfairly associating mental illness with criminal behavior. The facts of the case support a more careful conclusion. Cruz had a complicated behavioral and psychological history, but that history does not provide a single proven cause for the massacre. His criminal responsibility was established separately through his guilty plea and the resulting judgment. By the end of the legal process, one part of the story was settled. Cruz would never leave prison under his sentence. The death penalty had not been imposed because the jury voted 9-3 in favor of death rather than unanimously, as required under the law applicable to his case. Some families were deeply dissatisfied with that outcome. Their anger was part of the aftermath. For those who had wanted the death penalty, the life sentence did not feel proportionate to the magnitude of the loss. Others had to confront the reality that no punishment could truly represent the lives that had been taken. These reactions could coexist because grief does not follow a single legal formula. The sentence answered the state's question about punishment. It did not answer the family's questions about loss. Parkland, therefore, remains significant not because it has one simple lesson, but because it contains several difficult ones. It shows the consequences of an act of extreme violence. It shows how warning information can be mishandled. It shows how difficult it is to distinguish certainty from hindsight. It shows how a criminal case can establish responsibility while leaving deeper social and institutional questions unresolved. And it shows why remembering victims requires more than repeating a casualty figure. The lasting legacy of February 14th, 2018 is ultimately found in the people who were lost, the people who survived, the families who continue to remember them, and the institutions that were forced to examine what they had done and what they had failed to do. The final sentence imposed on Nicholas Cruz closed one chapter of the legal story. But the responsibility to remember the 17 people who died, to acknowledge the 17 who survived, and to learn from the failures surrounding the tragedy remains outside the courtroom. That is where the story of Parkland continues. The story of Parkland does not end with the closing of a courtroom door. It does not end with the sentence imposed on Nicholas Cruz, and it cannot be reduced to the number 17, even though 17 is the number that first tells us how devastating February 14th, 2018 became. 17 people were killed. 17 others were wounded. A former student returned to the school he had once attended, entered Building 12, and carried out an attack that would permanently alter the lives of families, survivors, and an entire community. Years later, the legal consequences were clear. Cruz pleaded guilty to all 34 charges. The jury voted 9-3 in favor of the death penalty, but did not reach the unanimity required. Under the law applicable to the case, on November 2, 2022, Judge Elizabeth Scherer sentenced Cruz to 17 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders, followed by 17 additional consecutive life sentences for the attempted murders. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. That was the legal conclusion. But the human story was much larger. To understand what remains after Parkland, it is necessary to return to the people whose lives were interrupted that afternoon. Alyssa Alhadeff was 14. Martin Duque Anguiano was 14. Nicholas Dworet was 17. Jamie Gutenberg was 14. Luke Hoyer was 15. Cara Loughran was 14. Gina Montalto was 14. Joaquin Oliver was 17. Elena Petty was 14. Alex Schachter was 14. Carmen Skintrup was 16. Peter Wong was 15. Meadow Pollock was 18. Helena Ramsey was 17. Scott Beigel was 35. Aaron Faze was 37. Chris Hickson was 49. 14 were students. 3 were members of the school staff. Their lives were different, their ages were different, and their roles within the school were different. But each was part of a community that expected February 14th to be an ordinary school day. None of them could know that the afternoon would become the defining event of their families' lives. The same is true of the 17 people who survived being shot. Their survival is an essential part of the story because the consequences of mass violence do not stop with those who die. The attack created survivors who had to live with what happened, families who had to mourn, and a school community that had to confront an event that could never simply be erased. A criminal sentence can determine where the perpetrator will spend the rest of his life. It cannot determine how other people will process their loss. It cannot restore a child to a parent. It cannot return a teacher or coach to a classroom. It cannot make a survivor forget the day on which ordinary life suddenly became something else. That is why the aftermath of Parkland became larger than the criminal prosecution of Cruz. It became an examination of warning systems, institutional responsibility, and the difficult question of whether something might have been done differently before the shooting. One warning in particular remains central. On January 5, 2018, a person acquainted with Cruz contacted the FBI and reported concerns about him. The information included his possession of guns, statements about wanting to kill people, erratic behavior, troubling social media material, and concern that he could carry out a school shooting. The FBI later acknowledged that the information should have been treated as a potential threat to life and forwarded to the Miami field office for further investigation. It was not. There was no follow-up investigation into that information at the time. That failure is one of the clearest institutional facts in the case. But it must also be understood within the limits of what can actually be proven. No one can know with certainty what would have happened if the information had been processed correctly. It is impossible to recreate the months before February 14th and determine exactly what a different investigative response would have produced. Perhaps further information would have emerged. Perhaps an intervention would have occurred. Perhaps investigators would have faced the same uncertainty and reached a different conclusion. The record cannot provide a definitive answer. What it can provide is evidence that a required process failed. That distinction is important because the purpose of studying a tragedy should not be to create an illusion of certainty. It should be to identify what is known, recognize what remains unknowable, and examine where systems did not function as intended. The September 2017 YouTube warning illustrates the same problem from another direction. The FBI received information concerning a comment threatening to become a school shooter. Investigators examined it, but could not identify the person behind the comment, and the investigation was closed in October. After the Parkland shooting, that earlier warning naturally became part of the public discussion. But it would be inaccurate to claim that authorities had identified Cruz as the person responsible for that comment and knowingly ignored an imminent attack. The information did not establish that connection at the time. The January 5th warning was different because it specifically concerned Cruz. But even that warning cannot be transformed into proof that the massacre was inevitable or certainly preventable. These distinctions matter because Parkland is a case in which hindsight can be particularly powerful. After 17 people have died, earlier signs appear more obvious. Behavior that once seemed troubling becomes part of a pattern. A warning that once existed as a piece of information becomes, after the fact, part of the story of an approaching disaster. But the responsibility of an investigative system is to evaluate information before the outcome is known. The failure in Parkland was not that officials possessed a perfect prediction of the future and chose to ignore it. The documented failure was that information requiring further attention was not handled according to the proper procedure. That is a narrower statement, but it is also a more accurate one. The aftermath also demonstrated the difference between individual and institutional accountability. Cruz was criminally responsible for the murders and attempted murders. The government faced civil litigation concerning the handling of the FBI warning. In 2022, the Department of Justice announced a settlement resolving 40 civil lawsuits for a total of $127.5 million. The department emphasized that the settlement was not an admission of legal liability. The distinction matters because a civil settlement and a criminal conviction answer different questions. Cruz's criminal case established his responsibility for the violence. The civil litigation concerned allegations surrounding the government's conduct before the shooting. Together, they show how the consequences of Parkland moved through different parts of the legal system. Yet even these legal outcomes could not resolve the deepest questions left behind. Why did the warnings fail to produce effective intervention? How should institutions respond when a person generates multiple concerns without there being a single piece of information that proves an attack is imminent? How should schools, law enforcement, and other agencies communicate when information about a possible threat appears? And how can those systems improve without pretending that every future act of violence can be predicted? Parkland cannot provide simple answers to all of these questions, but it demonstrates why they have to be asked. The case also reminds us to be cautious when discussing Cruz's psychological history. He received mental health support from approximately age 11 through age 18. He had behavioral and social adjustment difficulties and a history of disciplinary problems. Those facts were considered during the legal proceedings, particularly during the penalty phase. But none of them, alone or together, establishes a single cause for the shooting. Mental health treatment should not be treated as a convenient explanation for mass violence. The available facts do not justify reducing the tragedy to one diagnosis or one psychological factor. Cruz's criminal responsibility was ultimately established through his guilty plea. His background could be considered without becoming an excuse for the crimes. That distinction is important not only for accuracy, but also for fairness. The people who died did not become victims because of some inevitable chain created by their surroundings. They were students and staff members who were inside a school when Cruz chose to attack them. The responsibility for that decision belongs to him. And yet the broader system still had responsibilities of its own, to respond to warnings, to maintain appropriate procedures, to protect students and staff, and to examine failures when those responsibilities were not fulfilled. These truths can exist at the same time. The criminal responsibility of Cruz does not erase institutional failures, and institutional failures do not erase his responsibility. In the years after the shooting, the case therefore remained divided into several connected but distinct stories. There was the story of the victims. There was the story of the perpetrator and his background. There was the story of the investigation. There was the story of the missed warning. There was the story of the courtroom and the disputed punishment. And there was the story of what happened afterward to the people who survived. None should be allowed to replace the others. If the story focuses only on Cruz, the victims disappear behind the perpetrator's name. If it focuses only on institutional failure, the individual responsibility for the murders becomes blurred. If it focuses only on the legal sentence, it can create the false impression that the tragedy ended when the judge finished speaking. The truth is more complicated. The shooting lasted minutes. The investigation lasted years. The legal case ended with 34 life sentences. The grief did not follow a legal timetable. The names of the 17 victims remain the most important counterweight to the tendency to turn mass violence into statistics. 14 students and 3 staff members died. 17 others were wounded and survived. Their lives are the reason the case matters beyond its place in criminal history. The final lesson of Parkland is therefore not simply that one person committed an unforgivable act. It is that the consequences of violence extend far beyond the moment in which it occurs. A school becomes a crime scene. A warning becomes evidence in a later investigation. A family becomes a family living with permanent absence. A survivor becomes someone carrying the memory of an afternoon that cannot be undone. An institution is forced to examine its procedures. A courtroom must decide punishment. And years later, the central facts remain unchanged. On February 14, 2018, 17 people died at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, and 17 others were wounded. Nicholas Cruz was arrested approximately 75 minutes after the shooting began. He later pleaded guilty to all 34 charges. The jury did not unanimously recommend death, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The federal government later settled 40 civil lawsuits for $127.5 million, while explicitly not admitting legal liability. These are the documented outcomes. But the most enduring part of the story cannot be measured in dollars, sentences, or procedural findings. It is found in memory. The Parkland tragedy remains a reminder that victims must not become footnotes to the person who harmed them. It remains a reminder that warnings matter, procedures matter, and institutional responsibility matters. And it remains a reminder that acknowledging uncertainty is not the same as ignoring failure. Some questions can be answered, others cannot. We know what happened. We know who was responsible. We know that warnings existed, and that at least one critical warning was not handled according to procedure. We know how the criminal case ended. What we cannot know is exactly what might have happened if every warning had been acted upon perfectly. That uncertainty should not prevent reflection. It should make reflection more honest. In the end, the story of Parkland belongs not to the man who entered Building 12, but to the people whose lives were changed there. Their names remain. Their families remember them. Their community remembers them. And the responsibility of telling the story accurately is to make sure that, beyond the crime, beyond the investigation, beyond the courtroom, the 17 people who died are never reduced to 17 numbers.